How users took back Windows. The full story of Microsoft's Start menu ads and the collective pressure that killed them. The number Microsoft never announced. There is a number that Microsoft has never publicly announced, but that every senior executive inside that company knows by heart. It is the number of Windows users who opened their Start menu on any given day in the last 2 years, saw an advertisement sitting there, right where their apps, their files, and their pinned shortcuts were supposed to be, and quietly closed the menu without doing anything at all. Just closed it. Did not click the ad. Did not engage with the promoted content. Did not file a formal complaint with Microsoft's support channels. Did not even raise their voice to anyone nearby. They simply absorbed the experience, said nothing, and moved on with the rest of their day as if nothing had happened, as if this was simply the world they now lived in. Microsoft knows that number because they track every meaningful interaction inside Windows with extraordinary precision. Every surface in the operating system that can generate telemetry data is generating it, continuously, at scale. They know the click rates on promotional content. They know the dismissal rates. They know exactly how many times per day a given advertisement appeared in front of a human being who had paid for their device. And they know the precise percentage of those encounters that produced engagement versus the percentage that produced nothing at all. Just a quiet, undocumented, invisible form of rejection that accumulated day after day, week after week, across more than 1 billion devices worldwide. For 2 full years, Microsoft watched that number grow alongside something else: declining adoption rates for Windows 11, rising user frustration documented across every public forum and social platform where technology is discussed, and a competitive environment that was beginning to shift in ways that demanded a serious and credible response. The pressure built slowly at first, then all at once, in the way that pressure in large systems usually does. And then, this week, Microsoft made a decision. The Start menu ads are gone, removed, permanently. Rolled back across every edition of Windows 11 in the April 2026 update cycle. And the users who have been waiting for this moment, some patiently, some furiously, some with an exhausted resignation that had long since given up expecting good news, are not merely relieved, they are sending a message that every technology company on Earth needs to hear very clearly right now. Because what just happened inside Windows 11 is not a story about one feature and one operating system built by one company. It is a story about power, about who actually holds it when the relationship between a technology platform and its users reaches a breaking point, about how ordinary people, not regulators, not class action attorneys, not activist investors, not government committees, took that power back through sustained, articulate, collectively organized pressure. And about why the next 5 years of consumer technology are going to look completely different from the last 5 because of moments exactly like this one. A user decision Microsoft was forced to implement. Let us start with something that almost nobody is talking about correctly when they cover this story. The removal of Start menu ads from Windows 11 is being reported everywhere as a Microsoft decision, a policy reversal, a strategic pivot, an act of corporate, goodwill toward a frustrated user base. And technically, yes, Microsoft's engineers wrote the code, Microsoft's product managers approved the change, and Microsoft's marketing team will find a way to take credit for listening to user feedback. But the more accurate and more important framing is that this was a user decision that Microsoft was eventually forced to implement. The distinction matters enormously, and it matters for reasons that extend far beyond this specific product change. If you believe this was primarily Microsoft's idea, a voluntary course correction from a company that recognized it had gone too far, you draw one conclusion about the future. You conclude that large technology companies can be trusted to self-regulate, that their internal governance processes will eventually surface and address user experience problems, and that patience and goodwill toward the industry are justified, orientations for ordinary consumers to maintain. But if you understand that this was user pressure translated into corporate behavior change through a specific and reproducible mechanism, that is a completely different and far more empowering conclusion. It means that the mechanism works. It means that it can be applied again. It means that the power ordinary users believe they have lost in their relationship with the platforms they depend on is not actually gone. It has simply been dormant, waiting to be organized and directed with sufficient specificity and patience to produce results. We are going to establish exactly how that pressure was built, how it operated, and why it succeeded where so many previous attempts to hold technology companies accountable for their product decisions have failed or simply evaporated. But to understand the pressure, you first have to understand the full history of what generated it, because the Start menu story did not begin with Windows 11, and it will not end with this update. It is the latest chapter in a much longer story about what happens when a technology company starts treating its platform as a promotional vehicle rather than as a product. and about what eventually happens when the people on the receiving end of that treatment decide they have had enough. 4 decades of dominance and the strategic pivot that changed everything. Microsoft has been one of the most dominant forces in personal computing for 4 decades. At its peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Windows ran on over 90% of personal computers worldwide. The company's dominance was so complete, so structurally embedded in how businesses and individuals use technology, that the United States Department of Justice filed a landmark antitrust case against it. That case, and the regulatory environment it created, shaped Microsoft's behavior for the better part of a decade. The company became more careful, more measured, more attentive to the appearance of abusing its dominant market position. For a period, that enforced caution actually produced a version of Microsoft that was more genuinely user-focused than the pure market logic of its monopoly position would have required it to be. Then the world changed. The smartphone era arrived and Microsoft missed it almost entirely, not for lack of resources or engineering talent, but because its organizational structure and incentive systems were optimized for a world that was in the process of disappearing. The rise of Google and then Apple as dominant platform companies transformed the competitive landscape of technology in ways that reduced Windows from an unchallengeable monopoly to an enormously important but no longer singular platform. Microsoft's stock price stagnated for over a decade as investors watched the company struggle to find strategic relevance in a world where the center of gravity had moved to mobile and where the services and applications that users actually cared about increasingly ran on infrastructure that Microsoft did not own or control. Then Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014 and began rebuilding the company around a fundamentally different strategic vision, one centered not on selling operating system licenses as standalone products, but on building a cloud-powered subscription services business that could generate recurring, predictable compounding revenue regardless of which device or platform users preferred to access it through. That strategic pivot was, by virtually any business measure, a remarkable success. Microsoft became one of the most valuable companies in the world again. Azure became a dominant force in enterprise cloud computing. Microsoft 365 became the subscription backbone of professional productivity software globally. The company's financial performance over the decade, following Nadella's arrival, rewarded every investor and analyst who had bet on his vision. But that success created a new structural pressure that has direct and underappreciated relevance to everything that happened with Windows 11. When a company's business model shifts from selling a product once to generating recurring subscription revenue from services, the installed base of the platform those services ride on top of transforms in nature. It stops being simply a product to be maintained and starts being a distribution asset to be actively monetized. Windows, with its billion-plus active users, stopped being just an operating system in the eyes of Microsoft's finance and strategy teams and started being the largest software, distribution channel in the history of personal computing. And when you are running a business that needs services revenue to grow quarter after quarter to satisfy institutional investors and internal performance targets, the temptation to use that distribution channel more aggressively is not occasional. It is constant, structural, and extremely difficult for any executive team to resist indefinitely. The experiment that went wrong. The promotional insertion into Windows did not begin with Windows 11. It began much earlier in the final years of Windows 10 as Microsoft began carefully experimenting with H, what it could place inside the operating system without triggering a user backlash severe enough to threaten the platform's stability or its commercial relationships. Lock screen images became advertisements for Microsoft products and services. Suggested apps appeared in the Start menu, pushing titles that Microsoft had a commercial interest in promoting. The default browser and search engine settings were configured with increasing aggression to route users toward Edge and Bing. System notifications began surfacing Microsoft product recommendations alongside legitimate security alerts and system messages, training users to ignore warning signs they should have been paying attention to. Each experiment was measured carefully. Click rates were tracked. Dismissal rates were logged. User sentiment on public platforms was monitored by Microsoft's research and analytics teams. And the conclusion that the data initially produced, the conclusion that justified continued expansion of promotional content inside Windows, was that users would absorb a considerable amount of commercial insertion into their operating system without abandoning the platform, because the switching costs of moving to a different system were high enough, the alternatives were unfamiliar enough, and the inertia of existing workflows was powerful enough that most users would tolerate the intrusion rather than make the effort to change. That conclusion was correct in the short term, and it turned out to be catastrophically wrong in the medium term. Windows 11 is where the full consequence of that miscalculation came into view. When Windows 11 launched in October 2021, it arrived carrying hardware requirements that immediately alienated a large and vocal segment of the existing Windows user base. The TPM 2.0 chip requirement and the strict processor compatibility list meant that millions of computers running Windows 10 perfectly well, performing every task their owners needed them to perform without complaint, without failure, were simply declared ineligible for the new operating system. This was not a small inconvenience affecting an obscure category of edge case hardware. This was a significant, visible, and widely covered barrier that affected families. Students, small businesses, and individual users who had purchased computers within the previous few years in good faith, expecting those purchases to serve their needs for a reasonable, foreseeable future. The message those users received from Microsoft was that their hardware was obsolete even when it functioned perfectly, and that participating in the future of the Windows platform would require them to buy new equipment rather than simply download new software. That context is absolutely critical to understanding why the Start menu advertising landed with such explosive negative force when users began encountering it. Windows 11 had already asked users to accept a difficult and unexpected cost. It had already told a large portion of its audience that the upgrade to the new platform would require them to sacrifice something, either a hardware purchase they had not planned or the ongoing use of an increasingly unsupported operating system that would eventually stop receiving security patches. And then, after users had made that sacrifice or accepted that uncomfortable compromise, Windows 11 turned around and inserted advertisements into the most central and most frequently visited location in the interface they were now required to use. The combination created a level of resentment that was qualitatively different from the mild irritation that normally accompanies software complaints. Users were not simply inconvenienced, they felt betrayed. And betrayal, as any serious student of human psychology or consumer behavior will tell you, produces reactions that are far more intense, far more sustained, and far more socially contagious than simple dissatisfaction ever does. How the community built the pressure. The community response that emerged from that sense of betrayal was unlike anything the Windows user community had organized in years. Technology forums that normally fragment into dozens of competing sub-discussions about different aspects of operating system performance and configuration unified around a single, clearly articulated grievance. The Start menu ads were not complicated to explain. They did not require technical background to appreciate or specialized knowledge to understand. They were visually obvious, immediately legible to any user, regardless of their expertise level, and universally shared. Every Windows 11 home user encountered them simply by using their computer in the most ordinary, everyday way possible. That universality made them the perfect organizing point for collective user frustration. You did not need to know what a registry key was. You did not need to understand group policy or system administration. You just needed to have opened your Start menu, seen an advertisement sitting where your content was supposed to be, and felt the specific, unmistakable irritation of knowing that you had paid for the device and had not consented to that experience. The most technically sophisticated users in those communities did what technically sophisticated users always do when they encounter a problem with software. They found workarounds, documented them thoroughly, and shared them publicly for the benefit of everyone who lacked the knowledge to find the solutions themselves. Registry editor guides explaining exactly which keys to modify to disable promotional content spread through forums with remarkable speed and clarity. Group policy configuration tutorials walked ordinary consumers through the same settings that corporate IT administrators use to create clean, advertisement-free Windows installations for business environments, settings that had never previously been relevant to home users and that now became widely read practical guides. Third-party application recommendations for tools that could suppress Microsoft's promotional content at the system level circulated. Alongside these guides, creating an entire ecosystem of workarounds that documented, in exhaustive and publicly accessible detail, just how hard users were willing to work to undo a decision Microsoft had made about their own computers. The YouTube technology community amplified this frustration to an audience that extended far beyond the users already engaged in technical forums. Creators with substantial subscriber bases dedicated significant video productions to the Windows 11 advertising situation. Not short reactive takes, but carefully researched, carefully edited examinations of what Microsoft was doing, why they were doing it, what it meant for the future of consumer software ownership, and what practical steps users could take to address it. Some of these videos ran for 30, 40, even 60 minutes. Documentary. Length deep dives that treated the subject with the seriousness it deserved. The total view count across all the Windows 11 criticism content produced during this period reached into the tens of millions of views, distributed across dozens of channels and hundreds of individual pieces of content. The comment sections of those videos functioned as additional amplification surfaces, with viewers sharing their own parallel experiences, tagging people in their lives who had mentioned the same frustrations, and collectively building a visible, searchable, permanent public record of how widespread and deeply felt the problem actually was. Microsoft has the analytical infrastructure to monitor that public record, and they did monitor it. Their research and user experience teams were reading the forums, watching the sentiment data, tracking the engagement metrics on criticism content, and feeding all of it into internal reports that made their way into product planning discussions. The question was never whether Microsoft was aware of the problem. The question was always how much of it they needed to absorb before the internal business calculation. The spreadsheet that weighed advertising revenue against platform health consequences changed enough to produce action. The answer, it turned out, involved multiple variables moving in the unfavorable direction simultaneously, creating a convergence of pressures that finally tipped the calculation. The convergence of pressures. Adoption rates for Windows 11 were not meeting the internal trajectories Microsoft had projected when the operating system launched. The Windows 10 holdover population was proving far more resistant to migration than the historical patterns between Windows versions would have predicted. When Microsoft's own end-of-support deadlines for Windows 10 arrived, the expected migration surge, the predictable wave of users who finally upgrade to stay current with security patches, did not fully materialize on the scale that was needed. Users were making an active, informed, deliberate choice to continue running an operating system that Microsoft had officially stopped supporting with security updates rather than transition to a version of Windows that they had evaluated and decided they did not want. The cybersecurity risk logic that should have been driving users toward the supported version was losing to the user experience logic that was driving them away from it. That outcome was, for Microsoft's platform planning teams, genuinely alarming. Apple's Mac lineup was simultaneously becoming competitive in ways it had not been for many years, and the change was impossible to ignore in market share data and in the anecdotal evidence flowing in from every consumer technology community. The M-series Apple Silicon processors had transformed the performance and efficiency profile of Mac hardware to a degree that made direct comparisons with Windows machines unflattering for the first time in a long time. The M-series MacBooks were converting users who had spent their entire computing lives on Windows and had never previously given serious consideration to switching platforms. The price premium that Mac products have always carried, historically one of the most reliable objections Windows users raised against Mac adoption, had become dramatically easier to justify when the performance advantages were as measurable and as consistently documented as they now were. And macOS, consistent throughout its entire history in offering an interface free of advertising or promotional insertions at the operating system level, was increasingly attractive to users who had been slowly worn down by Windows 11's commercial overlay. Every frustrated Windows user who looked at a Mac and found the experience compelling was a data point in a trend that Microsoft could read in market research reports and had to take seriously. The Linux desktop ecosystem was undergoing its most significant practical improvement in the platform's history, driven largely by an unlikely catalyst, a handheld gaming device. The Steam Deck's commercial success had created powerful financial and engineering incentives for Valve to invest heavily in making Windows-native games run on Linux through its Proton compatibility layer. Those investments had paid off to a degree that surprised even the most optimistic advocates of Linux gaming. Major titles that had been effectively Windows exclusive for their entire commercial existence were running on Linux with performance figures that were, in many cases, competitive with their native Windows equivalents. The final objection that had kept millions of technically sophisticated and privacy-conscious users anchored to Windows despite all of their frustrations with the platform was dissolving in real time. And the technology community was documenting that dissolution loudly, persistently, and in enough practical detail that ordinary users were beginning to take it seriously as a real option rather than dismissing it as a technical enthusiast's fantasy. The decision and what it actually means. Microsoft read all of these converging signals through its internal data infrastructure and made the decision that the data demanded. The start menu advertisements had crossed a threshold. They had moved from being a net positive contribution to platform revenue into a net negative drag on platform health, generating whatever they generated in placement fees and engagement clicks while simultaneously and measurably contributing to adoption rate shortfalls, user sentiment deterioration, and competitive vulnerability in markets where trust and experience quality had become decisive factors in purchasing decisions. The business case for keeping them collapsed, and the feature was removed. That is the honest, complete, unadorned account of why this happened. And it is important to hold it clearly in mind because it shapes every realistic expectation about what should and should not be expected to follow. The update rolling out now as part of the April 2026 Windows 11 release cycle applies to all editions of the operating system, Home, Pro, and Enterprise. Every version receives the same clean start menu experience. This breadth of application is itself a meaningful signal about how Microsoft interprets the problem it was solving. They are not offering the advertising-free experience only to Pro and Enterprise customers who pay more and whose IT administrators have the institutional leverage of volume licensing negotiations. behind them. They are extending it universally, which means they have concluded that the user sentiment damage from the start menu ads was a platform-wide problem requiring a platform-wide solution. The Home Edition user, the person who purchased a consumer laptop from a retail store, who interacts with Windows purely as a personal device, who has the lowest switching costs and the highest exposure to competitive alternatives, is being specifically and deliberately addressed by this decision. The response from Windows communities has been immediate and emotionally visible in ways that go considerably beyond the typical reaction to a routine software update. Users who had been running third-party suppression tools, specifically to block Microsoft's promotional content, are publicly uninstalling those tools and reporting that the native operating system experience is now clean enough to trust without additional intervention. The authors of the most widely circulated registry editing guides and group policy tutorials, documents that have been read and shared millions of times over the past 2 years, are updating their content to inform readers that the workarounds they describe are no longer necessary. Longtime vocal critics of Windows 11's commercial direction, who had been publicly incredibly documenting their consideration of Linux migration as a serious, near-term plan, are acknowledging the change with the careful, earned optimism of people who want to believe things are getting better, but have been disappointed before, and are not prepared to extend unlimited trust on the basis of a single correct decision. What this change does not mean. Sustainable optimism about the trajectory of the Windows platform requires honest clarity about what this change represents mechanically and what it does not represent philosophically. Microsoft did not arrive at this decision through a values-based reconsideration of its relationship with users. It did not wake up one morning and conclude that treating its platform as a promotional vehicle was ethically incompatible with the trust that users place in the operating systems they depend on for the full range of their personal and professional lives. It arrived at this decision through a business case analysis that produced a negative return on investment figure. That distinction is not cynical, it is accurate and practically important. And it matters because the underlying commercial incentives that originally produced the start menu advertising decision are entirely and completely unchanged by this update. Microsoft still needs to grow its services revenue. The business model still depends on converting Windows users into paying subscribers for Microsoft's ecosystem of products and services. The pressure to monetize the platform's billion user reach is structural and ongoing and will not be relieved by any single product decision. What has changed is not the incentive to monetize. What has changed is Microsoft's understanding, hard-won through 2 years of negative user sentiment data, adoption rate shortfalls, and intensifying competitive pressure, of which specific monetization approaches carry net negative consequences for platform health at a scale that outweighs their direct revenue contribution. The advertising was removed because it stopped being profitable enough to justify the damage it was causing, not because it was wrong. Understanding that distinction is not pessimistic. It is simply accurate, and it informs a clearer and more useful picture of what should be watched for next. The most visible area where this evolution in approach, rather than retreat from commercial ambition, is playing out is in the ongoing development and deployment of Copilot, Microsoft's artificial intelligence assistant, which is being integrated more deeply and more pervasively into Windows 11 with every successive update cycle. Copilot is genuinely impressive technology in ways that the start menu ads never were. It helps users accomplish real tasks, drafting and editing documents, summarizing long content, answering complex questions, writing and debugging code, managing system settings, through natural language without requiring users to navigate menus they have never seen before. The productivity value it delivers is authentic and measurable, and the quality of the assistance it provides in many domains is sufficient to justify the attention Microsoft is giving it. But Copilot also operates firmly within Microsoft's commercial ecosystem. It defaults to Bing for search queries. It surfaces Microsoft services in response to relevant requests. It integrates with Microsoft 365 in ways that nudge users towards subscription products. The line between AI assistance that genuinely serves the user's interests and AI assistance that simultaneously and invisibly serves the platform's commercial interests is not always clearly drawn, and users who want to maintain an accurate understanding of their relationship with Windows need to think carefully and specifically about where that line actually runs. Copilot represents a more sophisticated form of platform monetization than a promoted tile in the start menu, one that is harder to identify as commercial in nature, harder to articulate as an objection because it is woven into capabilities that users genuinely value, and considerably harder to disable because the commercial and the useful are integrated rather than separate. Understanding this does not make Copilot less useful. It makes the full picture of what Microsoft is building with Windows clearer, and clarity about that picture is what allows users to engage with the platform intelligently rather than reactively. The trust that needs to be rebuilt. What Microsoft has the genuine opportunity to build from this moment, if it follows this decision with a consistent pattern of subsequent decisions that prioritize the user experience over the promotional impulse, is something that is both genuinely valuable as a human outcome and commercially powerful as a business result. A trust relationship with its user base that has been severely depleted over the past several years, and that is now, for the first time in a long time, showing signs of potential recovery. Trust is not built by a single correct decision. It is built by a consistent pattern of correct decisions maintained over time, against the constant internal pressure from business development teams, revenue planners, and product managers to make the commercially expedient choice instead. If the April 2026 removal of Start menu ads is followed by similar reassessments of File Explorer promotional placements, lock screen advertising content, notification system misuse for product marketing, and the settings application's aggressively transactional upsell behavior, Microsoft will be demonstrating a pattern rather than an exception. Patterns are what rebuild trust. Individual decisions, however welcome and however overdue, are just data points. They become evidence of a genuine and durable shift only when they are followed consistently over time by more of the same. Users who have been watching the situation closely and who have developed the healthy skepticism that 2 years of frustrating product decisions earns are not wrong to apply a higher evidentiary standard. They are being rational. Meeting that standard is both the challenge and the opportunity that Microsoft now holds in front of it. The commercial case for genuinely rebuilding that trust relationship is overwhelming, and Microsoft's own analytical teams understand it in more quantitative detail than most outside observers. A Windows user who genuinely trusts the platform does not spend time benchmarking Mac alternatives or reading beginner Linux migration guides. A Windows user who trusts the platform approaches Microsoft's legitimately excellent subscription products, and some of them are genuinely excellent, with goodwill and openness rather than the defensive skepticism of someone who feels they are being managed rather than served. A Windows user who trusts the platform recommends it to others rather than warning people away from it or conspicuously documenting their own plans to leave. The compounding commercial value of that trust relationship, accumulated across a billion user base over years and decades, is worth more than every promotional placement Microsoft could sell. Across every surface in Windows, across every quarter of revenue planning for the foreseeable future. The challenge is that trust generates its commercial return slowly and over time, while advertising generates its commercial return immediately and measurably in the current quarter. Corporate planning cycles and investor expectations are overwhelmingly oriented toward the immediate and the measurable. The executives who see through that orientation clearly enough to make the harder long-term choice are the ones who build platforms that survive, adapt, and genuinely matter over generational timescales. The mechanism that actually works. There is one final and perhaps most important thing this story teaches that applies far beyond Microsoft and far beyond Windows, and far beyond the specific and relatively mundane question of whether there should be advertisements inside operating system, start menus. It is about the mechanism through which ordinary users can actually and verifiably change the behavior of technology companies that have enormous structural market power and face very limited regulatory constraint under current legal frameworks. The mechanism that worked here is specific and reproducible and worth naming precisely. It was not a lawsuit. Legal action against large technology companies is slow, expensive, uncertain in outcome, and typically produces settlements that generate headlines but do not change the underlying product decisions that cause the problem. It was not regulatory intervention, which is slower still and which requires levels of political will and legal sophistication that are not reliably available when user experience problems are the subject rather than competition law. It was not a single viral moment of outrage that burned hot across social media for a news cycle and then faded as the next story displaced it. It was none of those things. It was sustained, specific, technically articulate, publicly documented, continuously amplified collective pressure applied consistently over a long enough period that the internal business calculation at Microsoft changed. Every person who wrote a registry guide and shared it publicly contributed to this outcome. Every YouTube creator who made a long, careful, detailed video about what Microsoft was doing contributed to it. Every forum moderator who kept the conversation active and the documentation current and the energy directed at the specific problem rather than dissipating into generic platform despair contributed to it. Every person who simply kept talking about it, kept mentioning it in conversations where technology came up, kept including it in their honest descriptions of the Windows experience when someone asked, kept making sure the frustration remained visible and named and current rather than allowing it to be quietly normalized and forgotten, contributed to this outcome. Collectively, they moved one of the largest and most powerful technologies, companies in the world, to change a product that runs on more than 1 billion devices. That is not an incremental or minor thing. That is the feedback mechanism that consumer technology desperately needs more of. And too many users have stopped believing it actually works. It works. It worked here in a specific and documented and publicly observable way against a company with enormous resources and strong structural incentives to do exactly what it had been doing. The next time a technology company makes a product decision that treats the people who purchased its product as a resource to extract value from rather than as human beings whose daily experience the product exists to serve, the same mechanism is available, the documentation approach is available, the community organization approach is available, the sustained, patient-specific pressure is available. Your device should work for you. The software running on your device should work for you, completely, transparently, and without anyone else's commercial agenda inserted invisibly into your daily experience without your knowledge or consent. That standard is not idealistic. It is not naive. It is not an unreasonable demand from people who do not understand how businesses work. It is the minimum that paying customers deserve from the companies whose products they choose to bring into their lives. More people understand that standard now and hold it more clearly and are more prepared to act on it than at any previous point in the history of consumer technology. More people are watching for violations of that standard, prepared to document them, share them, amplify them, and sustain the pressure until something changes. Microsoft felt that pressure, measured it carefully, and responded to it. The lesson of this story is not that Microsoft is now trustworthy or that the work of holding the platform accountable is finished. The lesson is that the pressure works and that it worked here, and that knowing it works is worth more than any single product update Microsoft could ever ship. Stay with this channel, because Windows 11 after this update is a meaningfully better product than it was before it. But better is not finished. And we are going to be here watching every decision that comes next, covering it with the same honesty and the same depth and the same willingness to say exactly what is true that this story deserved today. You earned that coverage. Every one of you who ever shared a registry guide, left a comment, watched a critical video, discussed this with someone who asked about Windows, or simply refused to pretend that the start menu ads were an acceptable part of the experience you paid for. You earned this outcome. Remember that feeling precisely, because you are going to need it again.